The fundamental architectural and doctrinal dichotomy in aircraft carrier design during the middle decades of the 20th century centered upon a singular, unforgiving engineering compromise: the delicate balance between maximum offensive strike power and catastrophic damage survivability. This debate, forged in the restrictive naval treaties of the interwar period and tested in the brutal, unrelenting crucibles of the Atlantic, Mediterranean, and Pacific theaters of the Second World War, manifested most starkly in the divergence between the unarmored carriers of the United States Navy and the Imperial Japanese Navy, and the armored carriers of the British Royal Navy. The strategic philosophies that guided these incredibly complex designs were not arbitrary or the result of engineering ignorance. Rather, they were deeply rational, calculated responses to the specific geopolitical requirements, anticipated geographic realities, and projected operational environments of their respective nations. In tracing the evolutionary lineage of these immense floating airfields, one uncovers a profound historical narrative regarding how military institutions calculate risk, project global power, and ultimately fight for survival in the face of unprecedented technological lethality and the rapidly changing nature of aerial warfare. To truly comprehend the origins of this monumental divergence in naval architecture, one must first deeply examine the severe constraints imposed by the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 and the subsequent London Naval Treaties of the 1930s. In the aftermath of the First World War, the victorious Allied powers sought to prevent another ruinous, economically devastating naval arms race by strictly limiting the total tonnage of capital ships and aircraft carriers that the major maritime powers could legally possess. Furthermore, these treaties capped the maximum displacement of individual newly built carrier hulls at 27,000 standard tons, with only minor allowances for experimental designs or vessels converted from existing battlecruiser hulls. Within these strict mathematical, legal, and physical boundaries, the world's premier naval architects were forced into making agonizing, zero-sum choices. In the realm of naval engineering, displacement is an absolute tyrant. Every single ton of high-tensile steel dedicated to heavy armor plating was a ton that could not be utilized for aviation fuel storage, spacious hangar decks, massive internal magazines for aviation ordnance, or the structural accommodations necessary to house, maintain, and launch a massive air group. The naval architect was trapped in an unforgiving equation of physics and diplomacy. One could construct a heavily protected, heavily armored ship that carried very few aircraft, or one could construct a highly vulnerable, relatively fragile ship that could launch a devastating, war-winning aerial armada. The United States and the United Kingdom, possessing vastly different global empires, strategic anxieties, and anticipated theaters of conflict, chose entirely different paths within this restrictive treaty framework. The United States Navy, looking outward from its shores across the vast, uninterrupted, and strategically isolating expanses of the Pacific Ocean, formulated a naval doctrine predicated upon long-range power projection, extensive scouting, and the absolute primacy of the offensive strike. American strategic planners, operating under the framework of War Plan Orange, envisioned a potential future conflict with the expanding empire of Japan as a sprawling, transoceanic campaign where massive fleet units would engage across hundreds or even thousands of miles of open, deep blue water. In such a vast environment, land-based aircraft would play a minimal, localized role in fleet-to-fleet engagements, meaning the primary and most lethal threat to an American aircraft carrier would inherently be enemy carrier-based aircraft. The American tactical calculus, deeply influenced by aviation pioneers and wargaming at the Naval War College, concluded that the most effective, and perhaps the only truly reliable, defense against an incoming enemy carrier strike was to launch a heavier, more devastating strike first. The goal was to outrange the enemy and destroy their flat tops before they could launch their own squadrons, or at the very least, destroy their flight decks while their aircraft were still being fueled and armed. This highly offensive, aggressive mindset birthed the concept that the best defense was an overwhelming, preemptive offense. To achieve this strategic vision, American aircraft carriers required the absolute maximum number of aircraft possible, prioritizing strike capacity, search density, and fighter protection above all other architectural considerations. This philosophy directly and profoundly dictated the physical architecture of the legendary Yorktown and Essex classes of fleet carriers, ships that would eventually become the backbone of the American victory in the Pacific. To maximize aircraft capacity while strictly remaining within the tonnage limits of the international treaties, American designers opted for an unarmored flight deck design. In these massive ships, the main structural strength deck, the heavy, load-bearing steel spine that literally held the ship together amidst the violent pitching and rolling of heavy seas, was the hangar deck itself. The flight deck, constructed of relatively lightweight teak or Douglas fir planking laid over a light, unarmored steel framework, was essentially a massive, expansive superstructure built on top of the main hull. This specific design choice yielded massive, war-winning dividends in offensive strike power. The American hangars were cavernous, open, rectangular spaces, often featuring large, rolling steel doors along the sides of the ship that allowed for excellent natural ventilation. This open design not only prevented the deadly buildup of highly explosive aviation fuel vapors but also permitted aircraft engines to be warmed up inside the hangar prior to being elevated to the flight deck, significantly reducing the time required to launch a massive strike package. Furthermore, the United States Navy pioneered and perfected the operational concept of the deck park. American carrier captains routinely stored, fueled, and maintained a large portion of their air group directly on the open wooden flight deck, exposed to the elements but immediately ready for action. They utilized ingenious methods, such as hanging the tails of aircraft out over the open water on outriggers, to maximize every square inch of available space. Consequently, an American Essex-class carrier, displacing roughly 27,000 tons standard, could operate an astonishing, seemingly impossible air group of 90 to 100 aircraft, depending on the specific mix of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers. This provided the American fleet commanders with a crushing numerical superiority in almost every engagement, allowing them to launch massive, highly coordinated, multi-layered strikes that could saturate enemy air defenses and obliterate enemy task forces. The American carrier was designed not as a floating fortress, but as a highly mobile, incredibly lethal glass cannon, designed to strike with apocalyptic force before the enemy could retaliate. Conversely, the British Royal Navy faced an entirely different, highly constrained strategic paradigm that necessitated a radically different approach to carrier design. Britain's immediate naval commitments and most vital sea lanes were heavily concentrated in the narrow, claustrophobic, and highly contested waters of the North Sea, the English Channel, and the Mediterranean Sea. In these geographically restricted theaters, the Royal Navy would be forced to operate continuously within the operational combat radius of hostile, massive land-based air forces, specifically the German Luftwaffe and, later, the Italian Regia Aeronautica. British strategic planners correctly deduced that their aircraft carriers would be subjected to relentless, heavy, and sustained bombardment from twin-engine level bombers and lethal dive bombers operating from unsinkable, land-based airfields. In many scenarios, the fleet would be attacked without the luxury of radar early warning, or the ability to launch a preemptive strike against the dozens of hidden airfields from which these threats originated. In this constrained maritime environment, attempting to completely dodge attacks was not a viable long-term operational strategy, and throwing up a combat air patrol consisting of a handful of carrier-based fighters would never be sufficient to stop a massed, multi-directional raid of over 100 land-based bombers. The British Admiralty concluded, through rigorous analysis and a healthy respect for the growing lethality of aviation ordnance, that their aircraft carriers must be physically designed to absorb direct, catastrophic hits from heavy armor-piercing bombs and continue to function, or at the very least, survive the inferno to return to a friendly port for repairs. This absolute requirement for extreme resilience and structural survival led the Royal Navy to design the illustrious class aircraft carriers, introducing the revolutionary and highly influential concept of the armored box. Unlike their American counterparts, the British designers made the flight deck the main structural strength deck of the ship. They armored this massive expanse of the flight deck with 3 solid inches of specially hardened armor steel, capable of defeating a 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb dropped from an altitude of 7,000 feet, or a 500-pound bomb dropped from virtually any altitude. The vertical sides of the hangar were armored with 4.5 inches of steel, and the deck immediately below the hangar was also heavily armored to prevent any shrapnel, explosive force, or burning aviation fuel from reaching the ship's vital magazines, steering gear, and propulsion machinery spaces. This incredible engineering feat created a heavily protected, fully enclosed citadel designed to keep the most devastating explosive forces entirely outside the ship's internal, critical volume. However, the laws of physics and naval architecture dictated that the penalty for this immense weight of steel situated so extraordinarily high above the ship's waterline was severe and operationally limiting. To maintain the ship's metacentric height, ensure stability, and prevent the massive vessel from simply capsizing in the notoriously violent storms of the North Atlantic, the overall height of the hangar had to be significantly restricted, and the ship was strictly limited to a single, relatively narrow, and highly enclosed hangar deck. The resulting sacrifice in offensive strike power was staggering and deeply controversial even within the Royal Navy. The original Illustrious-class carriers, despite displacing roughly the same tonnage as an American Yorktown-class carrier, carried a paltry, almost inadequate air group of only 36 aircraft. They were completely and totally reliant on this tiny air group for both offensive strike missions and defensive combat air patrols, a number so small that it severely limited the ship's ability to project meaningful offensive power against fortified land targets or large enemy fleets. Furthermore, the fully enclosed nature of the armored hangar created immense, sometimes lethal operational difficulties for the crew. The thick steel walls completely prevented natural ventilation, making the hangar incredibly dangerous in the event of an inevitable aviation fuel spill or the gradual buildup of explosive fumes. Aircraft could absolutely not run their engines inside the enclosed hangar due to carbon monoxide poisoning risks and fire hazards, severely complicating and slowing down the process of preparing a coordinated strike package. The Royal Navy also initially rejected the American concept of the open-air deck park, viewing the harsh, freezing, and highly corrosive weather of the North Sea and the North Atlantic as too detrimental to the delicate canvas, wood, and light metal structures of the era's aircraft, fearing that keeping planes on deck would result in unacceptable maintenance failures. Thus, the British armored carrier emerged as a brilliant, nearly indestructible masterpiece of defensive engineering, but a fundamentally crippled offensive weapon compared to its high-capacity Pacific counterparts, prioritizing the survival of the hull over the destruction of the enemy. The Imperial Japanese Navy, during the interwar period and the early, triumphant stages of the Pacific War, adopted an aircraft carrier design philosophy that closely mirrored that of the United States, prioritizing offensive capability over passive defense. The legendary Kido Butai, the first air fleet that executed the devastating surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, was composed of large, exceptionally fast fleet carriers like the Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, Soryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. These magnificent vessels featured unarmored, lightweight wooden flight decks and enclosed hangars built above the main strength deck of the hull. The Japanese naval architects prioritized maximum aircraft capacity, extreme sustained speed to outmaneuver enemy fleets, and long operational range to project power across the vast Pacific. Their naval aviation doctrine was arguably the most aggressive and offensive-minded in the world at that time, prioritizing massive, meticulously coordinated strikes involving hundreds of aircraft, Zero fighters, Val dive bombers, and Kate torpedo bombers, designed to absolutely overwhelm enemy air defenses in a single, annihilating, war-winning blow. The Japanese did not invest heavily in defensive architecture, damage control redundancy, or heavy armor plating, deeply believing, much like the Americans, that a successful preemptive strike utilizing their highly trained, elite aviators completely negated the need for heavy armor. This aggressive philosophy served them brilliantly during the opening 6 months of the war, allowing them to project unprecedented, unstoppable power across the Pacific and Indian Oceans, sinking Allied battleships and capturing vast territories with startling ease. The ultimate, brutal test of these radically divergent philosophies occurred when the theoretical blueprints and peacetime doctrines met the terrifying, chaotic reality of high-explosive ordnance, shrapnel, and fire in actual combat. The Mediterranean theater provided the ultimate, undeniable vindication for the British armored carrier concept, proving that in confined waters, armor was the difference between life and death. In January 1941, during the complex logistical effort known as Operation Excess, the armored carrier HMS Illustrious was tasked with escorting a vital, heavily laden supply convoy to the besieged, starving island fortress of Malta. The convoy was detected and intercepted by massive elements of the Luftwaffe's Fliegerkorps X, specifically elite, battle-hardened squadrons of Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers operating from bases in Sicily. In a horrific, highly concentrated, and perfectly coordinated attack, the Illustrious was targeted by dozens of Stukas plunging from the sky in near-vertical dives. She was struck by 6 massive armor-piercing bombs, most of them weighing 1,000 kilograms, and suffered 3 incredibly close near misses that ruptured her hull plates below the waterline. The attack was devastating, creating massive, raging fires across the flight deck, destroying parked aircraft in the hangar, and wiping out exposed anti-aircraft gun crews in a storm of shrapnel. However, the 3-inch armored flight deck largely performed exactly as its designers had hoped. While the heavy armor was penetrated in a few localized, weakened areas near the elevator lifts, the armored box successfully prevented the horrific, cascading internal magazine explosions and uncontrolled aviation fuel fires that would have inevitably doomed a lesser ship. The core structural integrity of the hull was maintained, the vital machinery spaces, engines, and boilers remained intact, and the carrier, despite suffering massive casualties, losing its steering gear temporarily, and becoming a raging inferno, was able to limp into the heavily bombed harbor at Malta under her own power. She survived further intense bombings while sitting helplessly in dry dock, received temporary patching, and eventually sailed under her own power all the way to the United States for permanent, extensive repairs. Had an American or Japanese unarmored carrier absorbed that exact same volume and weight of high explosive directly on its flight deck, it is a near mathematical certainty, proven by later events, that the vessel would have been reduced to a burning, sinking, completely unsalvageable wreck within a matter of minutes. The extreme, inherent vulnerability of the unarmored flight deck was tragically, repeatedly demonstrated in the vast expanses of the Pacific War, where the offensive doctrine met the reality of getting hit first. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 serves as the most iconic, pivotal, and horrific example of the utter fragility of the offensive-minded, unarmored carrier. The Japanese Kido Butai, caught at a highly vulnerable moment while frantically rearming and refueling their aircraft in their enclosed hangars for a strike against the American fleet, was struck by a relatively small and coordinated number of American SBD Dauntless dive bombers. The American armor-piercing and high-explosive bombs easily, almost effortlessly punched through the unarmored wooden flight decks of the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, detonating deep inside the crowded, enclosed hangar decks. The resulting explosions ignited the heavily fueled and armed Japanese aircraft, creating a massive, instantaneous chain reaction of secondary explosions involving torpedoes, bombs, and thousands of gallons of volatile aviation fuel that transformed the hangars into inescapable blast furnaces. The lack of heavy flight deck armor meant that a single, well-placed bomb could, and did, absolutely destroy a massive fleet carrier in the blink of an eye. The Japanese carrier Hiryu, launching a counterstrike that damaged the Yorktown, suffered a remarkably similar fate later that afternoon, struck by dive bombers that turned her unarmored hull into a raging inferno. The American carriers, built to the same unarmored philosophy, were equally vulnerable to this catastrophic damage model. At the Battle of the Coral Sea the previous month, the USS Lexington, a massive converted battlecruiser, was lost not directly to the initial Japanese torpedo and bomb hits, which her damage control teams initially managed, but due to massive, uncontrollable aviation fuel vapor explosions that tore the ship apart hours later. At Midway, the USS Yorktown was severely damaged by Japanese dive bombers penetrating her wooden deck, and while her crew valiantly fought the fires and kept her afloat, she was ultimately sunk by a Japanese submarine while attempting to be salvaged. Later in the grueling, attrition-heavy Guadalcanal campaign, the USS Wasp and USS Hornet were also lost due to torpedoes and bombs penetrating their unarmored hulls, starting massive, uncontrollable fires that forced their crews to abandon ship. These early, incredibly costly Pacific battles definitively proved that the unarmored aircraft carrier was essentially a fragile eggshell armed with a massive sledgehammer. Whoever managed to land the first heavy blow usually won the engagement, and the loser was entirely, violently destroyed. However, the American philosophy of overwhelming strike power also won the Battle of Midway, proving the strategic value of their design choices. The massive aircraft capacity of the American carriers allowed them to absorb severe, nearly total losses among their slow, vulnerable torpedo bomber squadrons while still delivering a fatal, war-winning blow with their high-altitude dive bombers. The inherent ability to launch a high volume of aircraft simultaneously proved to be the absolute decisive factor in the strategic victory that permanently turned the tide of the Pacific War. The Americans accepted the extreme vulnerability of their ships as a necessary, unavoidable cost of doing business in a theater where the absolute destruction of the enemy fleet's offensive capacity was the only viable path to victory. As the war progressed inexorably into late 1944 and 1945, the nature of naval warfare underwent a terrifying, unprecedented evolution with the introduction of the Japanese kamikaze tactic. The deliberate, suicidal crashing of an aircraft, heavily laden with aviation fuel and high explosives, directly into the flight deck of an aircraft carrier presented an entirely new, incredibly lethal kinetic and incendiary threat that naval architects had never fully anticipated. It was against the terrifying backdrop of the kamikaze that the final, most visceral, and starkest comparison between the armored and unarmored carrier doctrines would be drawn. By the spring of 1945, the British Pacific Fleet, designated as Task Force 57, was operating closely alongside the massive, sprawling American fast carrier task forces off the islands of Okinawa and the Japanese home islands. The British fleet included heavily armored carriers such as HMS Formidable, HMS Victorious, HMS Indomitable, and the newer HMS Indefatigable. The American fleet was composed largely of the magnificent, highly refined Essex-class carriers, representing the absolute pinnacle of the unarmored, high-capacity, offensive design philosophy. When the waves of kamikazes finally struck the British Pacific Fleet, the results were highly dramatic, terrifying to witness, but operationally brief. On May 4, 1945, a Japanese Mitsubishi Zero fighter, acting as a suicide plane, plunged directly into the flight deck of HMS Formidable. The aircraft, striking the 3-inch solid steel armor plate at high speed, essentially shattered and disintegrated upon impact. The bomb it carried detonated violently, creating a massive fireball, a deafening concussion, and a significant, sweeping dent in the heavy steel decking. Shrapnel caused horrific casualties among the exposed deck crew and destroyed several parked aircraft in the deck park. However, the absolutely critical factor was that the explosive energy, the shrapnel, and the burning aviation fuel were entirely contained above the armored deck. The armored box held firm. The fire, unable to penetrate into the hangar or the magazines, was quickly extinguished by the ship's dedicated damage control teams. Within a matter of hours, the crew filled the dent in the deck with quick-drying cement, swept the mangled debris of the Japanese aircraft and destroyed British planes over the side, and Formidable was remarkably, almost unbelievably, able to resume landing and launching aircraft to continue the fight. The Royal Navy liaison officer stationed aboard the American flagship famously remarked to his stunned American counterparts, viewing the rapid recovery, "When a kamikaze hits a U.S. carrier, it means 6 months of repair at Pearl Harbor. When a kamikaze hits a Limey carrier, it's just a case of, sweepers, man your brooms." While this famous quote contains a degree of institutional bravado and slightly minimizes the real casualties suffered by the British crews, it accurately captured the immense tactical reality and structural superiority of the armored flight deck against suicide attacks. HMS Victorious and HMS Indefatigable absorbed incredibly similar direct kamikaze hits during the Okinawa campaign and continued to operate, their armored decks successfully acting as unyielding anvils against which the Japanese aircraft shattered themselves harmlessly. The heavy armor completely prevented the devastating, deep-penetrating internal fires that routinely paralyzed American flight operations. The British design philosophy, originally conceived years prior to survive German Stuka dive bombers in the confined waters of the Mediterranean, proved accidentally but perfectly suited to surviving the desperate, apocalyptic Japanese suicide planes in the open expanses of the Pacific. The American experience with the kamikaze threat was vastly more traumatic, bloody, and structurally destructive. When a kamikaze struck an unarmored Essex-class carrier, the aircraft and its accompanying bomb would easily, violently smash straight through the wooden flight deck and detonate deep inside the enclosed hangar deck. The results were consistently apocalyptic. On March 19, 1945, the USS Franklin, an Essex-class carrier, was operating less than 50 miles from the Japanese coast when a single, undetected Japanese dive bomber, utilizing low cloud cover, dropped 2 heavy armor-piercing bombs directly onto her wooden flight deck. The bombs easily penetrated the wood and light steel, detonating squarely inside the hangar, which was incredibly crowded with fully fueled and heavily armed Corsair and Avenger aircraft preparing for an immediate strike. The resulting chain reaction of explosions, detonating bombs, cooking off machine gun ammunition, and raging aviation fuel fires literally ripped the ship apart from the inside out. Over 800 American sailors and aviators were killed in a matter of minutes, and hundreds more were horribly wounded by fire and shrapnel. The flight deck was completely destroyed, physically peeled back and buckled like a tin can by the massive internal overpressure of the exploding aviation ordnance. The ship was totally knocked out of the war, visually resembling a floating volcano, and only survived sinking due to the absolutely superhuman, legendary, and heroic efforts of her surviving damage control teams. Similarly, the USS Bunker Hill was struck by 2 kamikazes within 30 seconds of each other on May 11, 1945. The planes plunged through the wooden deck, igniting massive fires that killed nearly 400 men, destroyed dozens of aircraft, and turned the ship into a floating, helpless inferno, completely removing her from the combat theater and requiring extensive rebuilding. These horrifying, mass casualty incidents seemingly provided absolute, undeniable validation for the British armored deck concept. If one only looked at the photographs of the burning Franklin next to the operational Formidable, the debate seemed permanently settled. However, a deeper, more nuanced, and highly comprehensive operational analysis reveals a far more complex reality regarding overall fleet survivability, operational effectiveness, and the metrics of winning a global naval war. While the British carriers shrugged off direct kamikaze hits to their flight decks with relative ease, the brutal, unrelenting, daily tempo of the Pacific War heavily exposed the severe, inherent limitations of their armored design. The British carriers, owing directly to the severe weight penalties of their armor which restricted them to small air groups, deeply struggled to maintain the massive, continuous, and highly layered combat air patrols required to intercept incoming kamikazes before they could ever reach the fleet. The American fast carrier task forces, conversely, with their massive 90-plane air groups, could easily put dozens of highly advanced fighters, such as the F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair, into the air simultaneously. They formed a massive, nearly impenetrable, multi-layered wall of radar-directed interceptors, famously known as the Big Blue Blanket, that intercepted and shot down the vast, overwhelming majority of kamikazes miles away, long before they ever saw an American ship. The American philosophy of "the best defense is a good offense" had evolved perfectly. Massive, overwhelming fighter screens, strictly coordinated by highly advanced combat information centers utilizing long-range early warning radar and radar picket destroyers, became the primary, most effective armor of the United States Navy. The Americans accepted the grim reality that if a plane managed to slip through the net, the ship would suffer horrific, catastrophic damage, but they heavily relied on their overwhelming numerical and technological superiority in the air to ensure that very, very few planes ever got through the net in the first place. Furthermore, the incredible American superiority in internal damage control techniques, equipment, and training must be deeply emphasized and understood when discussing carrier survivability in the later stages of the war. The United States Navy, learning brutal, bloody lessons from the early, devastating losses of the Lexington, Yorktown, and Wasp, totally revolutionized their approach to fighting fires and controlling flooding. American carriers were extensively retrofitted and originally equipped with highly redundant, high-pressure water mains that could be rerouted if damaged, highly sophisticated chemical foam extinguishing systems, and massive, heavy steel fire curtains that could quickly drop to divide the massive, open hangar deck into smaller, isolated sections, preventing a fire from sweeping the entire length of the ship. Every single sailor on an American ship, regardless of their primary rating, was extensively trained as a firefighter. The open hangar design of the American carriers, while allowing bombs to penetrate easily, also ironically acted as a safety valve. It allowed the massive, destructive overpressure from internal explosions to quickly vent out the open sides of the ship, rather than being contained internally where it would buckle structural bulkheads, destroy the ship's keel, and compromise the vessel's fundamental structural integrity. American damage control doctrine dictated strict, unforgiving procedures, such as ensuring that aviation fuel lines were completely drained and rapidly purged with inert carbon dioxide gas the exact moment flight operations ceased, drastically reducing the risk of the catastrophic vapor explosions that had doomed earlier vessels. The Royal Navy's damage control, while executed by incredibly brave and dedicated sailors, was significantly, structurally hampered by the very architecture that was designed to save the ship. The enclosed, heavily armored hangars of the British carriers became incredibly lethal, inescapable traps if the armor was somehow bypassed, penetrated by an exceptionally heavy bomb, or if a fire started internally from a fueling accident. Because the hangars were heavily sealed steel boxes designed to maintain structural strength and keep bombs out, they inherently lacked adequate ventilation. If an aircraft caught fire in a British hangar, the intense heat and toxic smoke could not escape, quickly turning the enclosed space into a superheated oven that easily melted aluminum aircraft frames and suffocated desperately working damage control parties. Furthermore, because the British Admiralty relied so heavily on the passive defense of the armored flight deck to prevent damage from occurring in the first place, their internal firefighting systems, pumping capacity, and damage control protocols were arguably less sophisticated and less redundant than those developed by the Americans, who fully accepted and expected that their hangar decks would inevitably become chaotic battlegrounds of fire and explosion. The British structural approach to survivability was highly elegant and largely effective against overhead threats, but it inadvertently created secondary, highly dangerous hazards that severely complicated internal damage control efforts when the unthinkable occurred. The operational and logistical impacts of the differing airgroup sizes cannot be overstated when analyzing the overall strategic effectiveness of these vessels in winning the massive, oceanic war. The immense, unparalleled strike power of the American carriers allowed them to utterly and completely destroy the Japanese naval aviation forces at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, colloquially known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, and subsequently annihilate the remaining Japanese surface fleet, including super battleships, at the immensely complex Battle of Leyte Gulf. The American carriers were strategic weapons of mass destruction, capable of leveling entire heavily fortified island fortresses, completely obliterating enemy airfields across hundreds of miles, and sinking battleships through the sheer, overwhelming volume of ordnance delivery. The British Pacific Fleet, while fighting valiantly, absorbing kamikaze hits, and providing essential, highly appreciated support during the grinding Okinawa campaign, fundamentally operated as a junior partner simply because their armored carriers could not generate the massive, sustained sortie generation rates required for the high-intensity operations that characterized the late Pacific War. An American Essex-class carrier could easily launch a massive, coordinated strike package of 40 aircraft, recover them, rapidly rearm them, and launch them again, all while constantly maintaining a heavily armed 30-plane combat air patrol over the fleet. An illustrious class carrier, heavily burdened by its armor and possessing an air group less than half the size, constantly struggled to balance the strict requirement for self-defense fighters with the strategic need to contribute meaningfully to offensive strikes against land targets. To artificially increase their capacity and relevance in the Pacific, the British reluctantly resorted to adopting the American deck park system, permanently storing advanced Corsairs and Seafires on the open armored deck. This exposed the aircraft to the harsh, corrosive saltwater environment and placed them directly in the path of the very kamikaze strikes the armor was meant to defeat, thereby somewhat negating the primary, defining advantage of the armored hangar design in the first place. The Imperial Japanese Navy's desperate, late-war attempt to reconcile these two opposing philosophies resulted in the highly tragic design, construction, and brief operational history of the aircraft carrier Taeho. Following the disastrous, war-altering loss of 4 unarmored fleet carriers at Midway, the Japanese naval architects realized the urgent, undeniable necessity for significantly enhanced survivability. The Taeho, commissioned in early 1944, was intended to be the ultimate Japanese carrier, the first to feature a heavily armored flight deck designed specifically to withstand 1,000-pound bomb hits without penetration, alongside a fully enclosed hurricane bow to significantly improve seaworthiness and structural rigidity in heavy Pacific typhoons. She represented a deliberate synthesis of the British protective concepts and the Japanese desire for large, highly offensive air groups. However, the Tahoe incorporated a fatal, ultimately doomed architectural flaw that would swiftly seal her doom on her maiden combat voyage. Her deeply enclosed hangar decks, structurally necessary to support the immense weight of the heavy armored flight deck far above the waterline, suffered from terrible, highly inadequate ventilation systems. Furthermore, Japanese damage control training, equipment, and institutional doctrine lagged significantly, almost fatally, behind both the Americans and the British. During the massive Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the Tahoe, acting as the fleet flagship, was struck by a single, relatively standard torpedo fired by the American submarine USS Albacore. The torpedo hit, while not initially fatal to the massive ship, violently ruptured several aviation fuel tanks located in the lower hull. The damage control teams, lacking proper equipment, training, and understanding of fluid dynamics and explosive vapors, attempted to clear the highly volatile, explosive avgas fumes from the ship by opening ventilation shafts, activating fans, and even smashing glass windows throughout the vessel. This disastrous action only served to spread the highly explosive vapor evenly throughout the entire enclosed, unventilated volume of the ship's hull and enclosed hangar decks. When a random, inevitable spark ignited the massive accumulation of fumes several hours later, the resulting catastrophic internal fuel-air explosion literally blew the heavy armored flight deck completely off the ship, buckling the hull plates outward, destroying the structural integrity of the keel, and sinking the pride of the Japanese fleet in a matter of hours, taking most of her crew with her. The Tahoe disaster perfectly and tragically illustrates the extreme, hidden danger of enclosed architectural volumes on warships carrying massive quantities of highly volatile aviation fuel, definitively demonstrating that the heaviest armor plating cannot compensate for fundamental, systemic flaws in internal damage control doctrine, crew training, and basic ventilation engineering. Another fascinating, extreme example of Japanese carrier design evolution during this desperate period was the Shinano, originally laid down as the third super battleship of the Yamato class but converted into a massive, heavily armored support carrier following the Midway disaster. Displacing an astonishing 72,000 tons, the Shinano was the largest aircraft carrier ever built until the launch of the USS Enterprise decades later. She featured an incredibly thick armored flight deck, heavily armored sides inherited from her battleship origins, and was designed to act as a floating, unsinkable resupply and maintenance hub for other carriers, carrying a relatively small active air group but massive reserves of fuel and ordnance. However, her immense armor could not save her from the realities of naval warfare. While transiting to a safer port for final fitting out in November 1944, still incomplete and lacking proper watertight compartmentalization and fully trained damage control crews, she was intercepted by the American submarine USS Archerfish. Struck by 4 torpedoes, the massive, heavily armored Shinano slowly succumbed to uncontrollable flooding due to poorly designed watertight doors and inexperienced crew actions, sinking on her maiden voyage and proving once again that armor alone, regardless of its thickness, is insufficient without comprehensive, well-executed damage control and structural integrity. As the Second World War concluded and the tense, technologically rapidly advancing era of the Cold War dawned, the fierce debate between the unarmored and armored carrier philosophies underwent a final, definitive, and highly necessary evolution, driven entirely by the advent of heavy, fast jet aircraft and the terrifying specter of nuclear weapons. The United States Navy, deeply shaken by the horrific, mass casualty damage inflicted by the kamikazes on their unarmored ships, recognized that the wooden flight deck was no longer a viable, survivable design for a frontline warship in the atomic age. Furthermore, the immense weight, incredibly high landing speeds, and intensely hot jet exhaust temperatures of the new generation of naval jet fighters required a vastly stronger, heat-resistant, and significantly more durable steel flight deck simply to operate safely. The immediate, post-war American response to these new requirements was the Midway-class aircraft carriers. Displacing an unprecedented 45,000-ton standard, these colossal ships were specifically designed to incorporate a heavily armored flight deck while successfully maintaining the massive, offensive air groups that absolutely defined American naval doctrine. However, because naval architects were still transitioning between eras, the Midway class retained the fundamental, older American architectural layout where the internal hangar deck remained the primary strength deck of the ship, with the massively heavy armored flight deck built as a separate, heavy superstructure on top of it. This specific engineering compromise resulted in ships that were notoriously top-heavy, prone to violent, dangerous rolling in heavy seas, and functionally very wet ships, constantly struggling to maintain safe flight operations in poor weather conditions due to their low freeboard and poor seakeeping characteristics compared to the Essex class. The ultimate, permanent resolution to the survivability versus strike power dichotomy, the final synthesis of the two opposing wartime philosophies, arrived in the 1950s with the design and construction of the revolutionary Forrestal-class supercarriers. These massive, groundbreaking vessels, which laid the absolute foundational architectural blueprint for all modern United States Navy nuclear-powered aircraft carriers up to the current, technologically advanced Gerald R. Ford class, represented a brilliant, highly harmonious synthesis of the absolute best elements of both the British defensive and American offensive wartime philosophies. The visionary naval architects of the supercarrier era fully recognized that the massive, unprecedented overall size of the new vessels, easily displacing over 60,000 tons, finally allowed them to fully integrate the heavy, armored flight deck directly into the main structural strength hull of the ship, exactly as the British had successfully done with the illustrious class, without sacrificing the vast internal volume required for massive American air groups. The supercarriers featured a massive, heavily armored, continuous high-tensile steel flight deck that served as the primary load-bearing spine of the warship, providing unparalleled structural rigidity, immense strength for operating heavy jets, and incredible protection against overhead threats and conventional battle damage. Simultaneously, the immense displacement, deep draft, and wide beam of the hull allowed for cavernous, highly compartmentalized, and well-ventilated hangar decks capable of easily accommodating massive air groups of over 80 large, heavy jet aircraft, thereby fully retaining the overwhelming, war-winning offensive strike power that had defined the American victory in the Pacific War. Furthermore, the introduction of the angled flight deck and the deck edge elevator, brilliant innovations heavily pioneered and developed by the British Royal Navy in the immediate post-war years, allowed the supercarriers to operate far more safely and efficiently without the dangerous, enclosed, structural internal elevators that had severely weakened the flight decks and complicated damage control on all earlier wartime designs. The modern American supercarrier is, in essence, the ultimate armored carrier, possessing a flight deck capable of withstanding the immense, punishing kinetic forces of landing 30-ton jets and absorbing significant conventional battle damage, while simultaneously functioning as the most powerful, high-capacity, offensive mobile airfield ever conceived by human engineering. The historical, bloody debate between the unarmored and armored flight deck was never truly won by either the unarmored or the armored faction exclusively. Rather, it was definitively resolved through a massive, exponential increase in overall ship displacement, revolutionary advancements in metallurgical engineering, and the synthesis of naval architecture, allowing modern navies to achieve maximum, necessary survivability without compromising an ounce of catastrophic, required strike power. The legacy of the shattered, burning wooden decks of the Franklin and the dented, resilient steel plates of the Formidable lives on intimately in the very DNA of every modern flat top that patrols the global oceans today, acting as a silent, enduring testament to the agonizing, highly technical, and deeply bloody engineering compromises forged in the relentless fires of the greatest naval conflict in human history. The evolution of the aircraft carrier from a fragile, converted cruiser to a heavily armored, nuclear-powered behemoth is a narrative of constant adaptation, where the terrifying lessons of combat dictated the shape of steel, proving definitively that in the realm of naval warfare, true supremacy requires both the unstoppable spear and the unbreakable shield, united within a single, massive hull.